chapter 29, section 2, and it's called The Triumphs of a Crusade. And the civil rights activists and breaking through racial barriers. This activism led to some historic laws. And so I want to start with buses. The Congress of Racial Equality, known as CORE, in 1961 decided to test the Supreme Court decision banning segregation on public transportation. So the United States Supreme Court ruled there could be no segregation on buses that crossed state lines. But the question was, who's going to enforce this? What happens if a black person sits in the front of a bus when that bus goes into Alabama? I'll tell you what happened. What did happen on multiple occasions is that bus was surrounded by members of the Ku Klux Klan, and those angry mobs would pull people off of those buses and beat them and tell them to go back up north. Happened multiple times. In fact, it was happening so often, those people were calling themselves the Freedom Riders. Again, sitting on the front of a bus. You might not think of it as a big deal, but it's a sore spot because it puts a person on the same playing field as another. It's equating equality. And these people, whites and blacks sitting together, began riding these buses. And again, Alabama mobs, more often than not in Alabama, but Mississippi as well. Louisiana was no innocent in this. It was happening in many southern states. One bus even was surrounded, and they began throwing Molotov cocktails, just kind of improvised explosives, and they set the bus on fire with the people inside, and as many as could fled out, were beaten and sent home. But the amazing thing about this is more people kept doing it. And there were even trainings for this. Okay, Freedom Rider training at this place at this time. You go to the place at that time, they warn you. Do you understand that by doing this, you might get killed? And they even documented those warnings. And you can watch films of people saying, who still wants to do that? Who still wants to do this? Raise your hand, and everyone raised their hand. People understood there was a risk to what they were doing. It was so dangerous, and violence was so common, that bus companies started refusing to carry these Freedom Riders. They're like, we don't want any trouble. We're just running a business. We have to drive into Alabama. I'm just a driver. Like, come on, people. And so it got so bad that Attorney General of the United States, Robert Kennedy, brother to John F. Kennedy, began to pressure the bus companies to continue transporting these riders because they had to, after all. They're paying customers. They're a public company. And at the end, they began to actually put armed law enforcement officers onto these buses. So here's one of these buses. For years, buses like this were segregated along racial lines. African Americans had to sit in the back of the bus. White people sat in the front of the bus. And you didn't mix. You just didn't. Except for these Freedom Riders. Now, Alabama refused to enforce this Supreme Court order. They said, hey, if people show up on the side of the road, what are we supposed to do? And the beatings continued. The violence continued. That's another important fact about nonviolent civil disobedience, is it's going to get you hurt because you're breaking a law. You're doing it peacefully. It's either going to get you arrested, if you're lucky, and that happens without violence. But again, we have how much evidence of the police beating people, sicking dogs on people, shooting tear gas at people? It's probably going to get you hurt. And then woe be it unto you if these angry mobs take matters into their own hands, like was often happening in the state of Alabama. So again, like the Little Rock Nine, this forced the president's hand. And so Kennedy began putting U.S. Marshals carrying weapons on these buses. And you can imagine what happened the next time in Alabama when angry mob shows up and the first person off the bus shows their badge and a firearm and says, now who wants to mess with it? Now who wants to start something? Attacking a federal marshal is, again, a federal crime. It's a felony. You do it in a mob, that's insurrection. And so eventually the Interstate Commerce Commission began to back up what the Supreme Court here was doing. Ole Miss. It's an amazing story. In 1962, James Meredith signed up to enroll at the University of Mississippi. So we've already seen this in Arkansas and Alabama. We've already seen governors stand in front of these universities and make their speeches and order the National Guard and be removed by the United States Army. But in this, and okay, Governor Barnett did the same thing. He made his speech. He barred the way for James Meredith. And of course, the president ordered federal marshals to walk Meredith into the campus. But the governor of Mississippi took matters to a really weird place. He went on the radio all over the airways of the state of Mississippi, and he told the people of his state to riot. He said, you see federal officers, hurt them. You see federal buildings, destroy them. You see black people, put them in their place. And people went crazy in Mississippi. And Mississippi was in a state of full-blown rebellion. They still fly the Confederate flag down there on their state building. It's part of their state flag. And guess when that became a part of their state flag? 1960s. Guess which state was the last one to surrender in the American Civil War? Mississippi. The last one to rejoin. So this is a deeply embedded place of Southern sympathizers, of Confederate wannabes, racist. So federal officials had to go with James Meredith to his classes. There were that many death threats. There were that many people that wanted to hurt him. They actually had to give his parents protection. In fact, if you want to watch a great movie about this story, check out Mississippi Burning. It's got Tommy Lee Jones. It's got the guy who played Merle in Guardians of the Galaxy. It's got a really great cast, and it follows the story of the integration of the University of Mississippi. So again, if you go to the African American History Museum at the Smithsonian, and you should, you'll see these photographs. So here's James Meredith with his federal escort, and he became the first African American student to enroll and integrate the University of Mississippi. He had to go before a federal court. He had to argue with his lawyer of his right to attend this university because the state of Mississippi said no. And when the federal government overruled the governor said riot. Now, I've already gone a little into the story of Birmingham. Dr. King was actually arrested in Birmingham while leading a march there to integrate parts of the city. Dr. King wrote his famous letter from a Birmingham jail while there. But again, the beauty of this is when you watch these things, when you see these things, you can see police attacking children, using fire hoses on unarmed people, using dogs to attack unarmed people, hitting unarmed people with clubs. And yet these protests continued. And these boycotts continued. And all of this was very well documented. And these people effectively shamed the country. But yet these southern states were just not going to comply. And so these people shamed the federal government into doing something about it. So in June of 1963, John F. Kennedy sent federal troops to force Governor Wallace, and I showed you the scene from Forrest Gump yesterday, to desegregate the University of Alabama. And of course, you also saw in the clip Wallace made his speech. Alabama was integrated, and then Wallace ran for president, and he ran as a separatist. He said, "If you elect me, we will rebuild the Confederate States of America." You know, he was a South Rise Again opponent, and he got a large percentage of the popular vote. He ran as an independent, and he got a scary percentage of the popular vote. But he won several southern states as an independent. And next, I have a brief eulogy of Medgar Evers. He was a worker at the NAACP, and he was murdered by members of the Ku Klux Klan. And the trial of the murderers led to a hung jury. A hung jury means the jury could not decide on the guilt or innocence of his alleged killers. And so his killer was set free. No one was ever convicted of the murder of Medgar Evers. So here's a little of his story.
A bullet from the back of a bush took Medgar Evers' blood. A finger fired the trigger to his name. A handle hid out in the dark. A hand on in their game. You're better than them. You've been born with white skin, they explain. And the Negro's name is used, it is plain.
And so that was the song Only a Pawn in Their Game by Bob Dylan. And it eulogizes the story of Medgar Evers. And I love the photographs that the person who put that together chose, which is why I decided to show that to you, because what I want you to understand is what we were talking about yesterday with Grapes of Wrath, and how the poor are being turned against one another. You know, when that contractor pulled up to that migrant camp and he had that officer with him, that officer was a poor white man too. And maybe you remember in the early chapters of the book where that young man was driving that tractor that knocked over the Jode's house. He was a poor white man. He was a pawn in the game because he was given $3 a day to drive that tractor and knock over people's homes. And he chose to take that money because his family was poor too. But he was being used as a tool to hurt the poor. And you saw example after example. And how we're often divided amongst ourselves because it's so easy to do. And that causes us to ignore the bigger issues. It's easy to squabble over various things. It's more difficult to unite around more common causes. But occasionally, you know, an inspirational figure like Martin Luther King will come along and say, here's something worth fighting for. Here's something worth dying for. And so in August of 1963, 250,000 people converged on Washington, D.C. And when we go to D.C., this is absolutely one of the things we'll look at. In fact, when you go up the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, which we will, we usually do that around sunset. It's a really nice time to go there. We'll walk over to the step. It's usually crowded because it's a really neat place, where Dr. King sat and gave his famous I Have a Dream speech. And I've got an excerpt of the speech to share with you in just a moment from the video footage of this. And he says it so much better than I could, so I'll let him say it. But in short, it's calling for immediate passage of a bill that Congress was debating, that the president wanted to sign, and it was the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And it banned discrimination on the basis of race, religion, and gender. And so here's Martin Luther King.
The high point of the civil rights movement of the early 60s took place the following summer in Washington. On August 28, 1963, more than 250,000 Americans from all parts of the country converged for the largest demonstration ever held in the Capitol. And the words of the Reverend Martin Luther King drew the attention of the nation and the world.
Will be able to join hands with little white
here's a photograph of Dr. King at that very moment. You can see the Washington Memorial in the background. You can see the reflecting pool, and then behind him is the Lincoln Memorial. And so, yes, this was in August of 1963 when that speech was given. And this was, often considered the high point of the movement, but it wasn't the end. The Congress of Racial Equality and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee continued to work for integration, but also to work to register blacks to vote. And Mississippi became a focal point of this movement because Mississippi, like many other southern states, did not want blacks voting. And so from 1896, or even further back from 1867 or 76, all the way to 1965, southern states were implementing the literacy tax, the poll tax, or literacy test, the poll tax, the grandfather clause to prevent blacks from voting. And so when these civil rights workers started going to register blacks to vote, they were beaten. In some cases, they were killed. Businesses and homes and churches were set on fire. And this actually resulted in the birth of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, which was a group of black voters who, led by Fannie Lou Hamer, worked to get more blacks registered to vote. But now, Lyndon Johnson, the very man who signed the '64 Civil Rights Act, was afraid of losing the Southern white vote. I mean, really, he had already affiliated himself with the civil rights movement. But he began to pressure these leaders to compromise, to give in, to stop pushing this issue.
Ooh, yeah.
Before the 1964 presidential elections, hundreds of volunteers, white and black, traveled to Mississippi to help register black voters. It would later become known as Freedom Summer.
Blacks were legally able to vote, but in many places in the country, when they got to the polling place, they would be given tests on Chaucer, on arcane examples of 14th century English law, things that no one could possibly pass.
In Alabama, in Georgia, in Mississippi, you had to pass a so-called literacy test. On one occasion, a man was asked to give the number of bubbles in a bar of soap.
Despite the efforts of civil rights workers, not enough new black voters are registered to have an impact on the presidential election. At the same time, many Southern white Democrats are leaving the party because of Johnson's strong support of civil rights.
Johnson's opponent would be Senator Barry Goldwater of Arizona. Goldwater said, I'm not against civil rights, but I think this bill, the Civil Rights Bill, is unconstitutional. People got the message, especially in the white South, and Johnson was agonized to see that in his home region, very quickly in the polls, Goldwater was getting about 80% to Johnson's 20%.
Johnson wins the election by a landslide, but it's clear he's lost voters in the South, a fact noted by black leaders.
Martin Luther King Jr., he had a conversation with President Johnson, and he said, we need a voting rights act.
Johnson says, well, I'm for voting rights, but this ain't the time.
But civil rights leaders don't want to wait. In the spring of 1965, they pressure Johnson to act, staging a nonviolent march in the little-known town of Selma, Alabama.
In Selma, Alabama, in 1965, only 2.1% of blacks of voting age were registered to vote. So on Sunday, March 7, 1965, about 600 of us held a nonviolent workshop. We lined up in twos to walk from Selma to Montgomery to dramatize to the nation that people of color wanted to register to vote. We came to the apex of the Edmund Pettus Bridge, crossing the Alabama River. On the other side, you saw a sea of blue, Alabama state troopers.
Advance toward the group. See that they turn around and disperse.
You saw these men putting on their gas masks. They came toward us. beating us with nightsticks and bullwhips, shrimping us with horses, releasing the tear gas.
A lot of white Americans were on the fence on civil rights. Then they saw those pictures on television from Selma. That was something new and horrible. It converted a lot of Americans.
Johnson clearly saw that march as something that would help him get the Voting Rights Act passed.
And so the Selma campaign, you saw the first march where 600 people lined up and crossed that bridge into Selma, Alabama. You saw the police lined up against them. You saw the tear gas. You saw them beat people. And guess what? So did everyone watching television in 1965. And you also saw, that was John L. Lewis. He's still alive, still travels the country and speaks. I've been wanting to see him forever. You saw the photographs of these people meeting with President Johnson. You saw Martin Luther King meeting with President Johnson and saying, we need a Voting Rights Act. And Johnson saying, I don't think that it's right politically. I don't think the time's right. We need to wait. And so the people took matters into their own hands. And they said, well, there's a 15th Amendment saying blacks can vote. Why are the police beating people while they're registering to vote? That's a violation of the Constitution. And so what the people were able to do is to say, are we a country of laws? Or are we going to allow these people to be lawless? And they shamed the government into doing something. And so Congress passed the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Johnson signed it. It put an end to the literacy test, and it set federal officials, not state officials, to enroll people to vote. And so more blacks were able to vote as a result of this. So this is a plaque outside of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama. It's in memory of these 4 girls who were killed here by members of the Ku Klux Klan. In the fellowship hall, in the kitchen of their church, they were preparing a meal for that night. And someone dropped bombs into the church, and these 4 girls were killed.